For all their peaceful beauty, the Ozark Mountains are carpeted in a dense and for a long time largely untamed wilderness. But for nearly 2 centuries among the forests, foothills, and hollows of the Ozarks, people, by inclination or necessity explorers and pioneers, have eked out ways of life that have evolved into communities which share a rich and unique culture. As a result of a lifetime of study, coupled with the irreplaceable experience of seeing the evolution of the area with her own eyes, there are few people better equipped to understand this culture and its impacts upon literacy than Miss June Westphal of Eureka Springs. Miss Westphal lives a life that is devoted to the preservation and understanding of Ozark history, culture, and literacy. June Johnson was born July 19, 1938, to Glenn Johnson and Lena Worley Johnson in the small community of Greenwood Hollow, just outside Eureka Springs, Arkansas. She is the second youngest of her parents' 8 children. Miss Westphal grew up in a literacy and cultural tradition that is becoming less and less common in this area as time goes on. She describes a family tradition that was for a long time largely free of formal education, at a time in which there were truly no educational opportunities afforded to her ancestors, which Miss Westphal has traced back 9 generations, some of whom were among the first to settle the region. These individuals lived off the land, and most never went to school, instead learning subsistence agriculture and hunting. She attributes part of her family's way of life to the lack of centralized government in Carroll County at that time, because it was before Eureka Springs had been founded, and the county seat of Berryville was being rebuilt after being burned to the ground during the Civil War. Miss Westphal was born in a log house built by her father. Despite their relative isolation, she describes her family as quite literate, especially her father, who she said always knew and expressed the value of education and literacy in his children and the other children in the community. Still, they had very little, and in the house in Greenwood Hollow was a single book, a collection of illustrated Bible stories designed to teach children. June was immediately drawn by the bright colors and pictures at a very young age, and must have inherited her father's inclination towards self-education, because it propelled her to a life of continued learning and enrichment. Even when the family would later move into Eureka Springs, the books in the family home were limited, mostly Western novels given to her older brothers. In the isolation and wilderness of Greenwood Hollow, the only connection that June and her family had to the outside world was a battery-operated radio, and occasionally a Kansas City Star that her mother and father would pick up while getting supplies in town. She describes the voice of the radio weatherman C.C. Williford as one of the first human sounds she ever heard outside her own family. It was from these sources that Miss Westphal first encountered what she calls the literate voice of those with different backgrounds and education, and she was hooked. After begging her father to let her go with the older children, June began her education just across the garden patch at the Pine Grove School, which served the district's 1st through 8th graders when she was 5 years old. She immediately developed a love for learning and especially for books, which in her memory condenses around the class's metal bookcase, filled with the books she would come to cherish. The books were supplied by one Coy Logan, the supervisor of the county schools. He would circulate the books a few at a time among the small schools scattered across the area. Miss Westphal remembers the excitement she felt as she saw Mr. Logan's car drive up, bringing a box of new books the school hadn't had before. As she grew up, she witnessed her father's advocacy in the education of local children and her mother's penchant for writing letters to family members, including 2 of June's brothers, when they went off to fight in the Second World War. June graduated Eureka Springs High School in 1955, and though she had entertained the idea of attending college, she immediately began a job at the Eureka Springs Chamber of Commerce, which was run by a Mr. Sam Lee, often styled Mr. Eureka, who had been in the area since the 1890s. It was her job here and her work with Mr. Lee that would begin to shape the course of her life and literacy. During her work for the Chamber, she read every book she could get her hands on concerning the history and culture of the Ozarks and Eureka Springs, and became adept at interfacing with the public. She continued her first professional life with a job at a business office for Kraft Foods, where she used the skills that she said were taught to women in school at that time: shorthand, typing, etc. After this job, the rest of Miss Westphal's life has been devoted to the history, culture, and community of Eureka Springs. She was always reading as well, and became good friends with Mrs. Catherine Osterhage, the librarian at Eureka Springs Carnegie Library. The two compiled a history of Eureka Springs, named after a poem that Mrs. Osterhage had written, entitled A Fame Not Easily Forgotten. She was also involved in compiling a pictorial history of the library itself, establishing a historical museum, as well as being a part of various restoration and preservation efforts in Eureka Springs. The definition of literacy, of course, is contentious and admittedly poorly understood by most lay people. But if we understand literacy loosely as a set of social practices associated with a particular domain, it is clear that the course of Miss Westphal's life demonstrates a commitment to what one might call a civic literacy, that is, the knowledge and skills required to engage with one's community in a meaningful and productive way. Indeed, it is difficult to imagine a better case for the inexorable connection between literacy and place than that of Miss June Westphal. Not only was her literacy inspired and sponsored by the place in which she happened to be born, but her experience suggests a reciprocal relationship with literacy, in which Miss Westphal has impacted her local literacy tradition immensely. This understanding of literacy as an interactive process is a good one for educators to hold. June Westphal wasn't pushed into her interests by a strict curriculum at a school. Instead, she used the tools she gained in her education to better access her passions. Her entire understanding of literacy developed from her place in life, but her efforts have permanently affected that place. This suggests that the most authentic literacy develops from a deep understanding of place. Perhaps if schools and educators viewed literacy as a set of skills one could use to interact with the world in a meaningful way, they could better prepare talented and hardworking people like Miss June Westphal to contribute to the world in ways not easily forgotten.